Philip, what's happened to the distribution of wealth in the US?
Well, I think it's very clear what in effect has been created is sort of out of democracy has sprung oligarchy, and wealth has concentrated, and it is concentrated in unprecedented proportions. And what this means is as you draw wealth and power together to kind of fewer and fewer people, more and more people become proletarianized and become reliant just upon wages, and wages are failing to deliver. So you create an endemic structural problem in the society.
Well, illustrate that with, say, the wealthiest families in the US.
Well,
what was it like in '68, for example?
Yeah, for instance, in 1974, the top 1% of US families had just under 9% of US GDP. In 2007, the top 1% of US families had 23.5% of US GDP. So that what you've actually seen is a very small group of people have captured all the wealth, the opportunity and the innovation. And what globalization is a multiplier platform for those effects. So if you win now, it's almost like you win much bigger than you ever did before.
What does that mean for the US? How on earth can they change that distribution, or do they need to?
Well, once you create an oligarchy, it's very difficult to shift it, and then in effect you create sort of a rentier state. And what that means is that you create rent-seeking behaviour, because once you concentrate wealth to that level and to that degree, it becomes basically impossible for anyone else to break into it. And you create a whole raft of vested interests that essentially can game the remaining players for an unprecedented period of time. So they offshore, they don't pay taxes, they're in a position to manipulate states, for want of a better reason, and the people who live in them. And that's very, very problematic, because then that means that democracy doesn't deliver prosperity. And if democracy doesn't deliver prosperity, but in effect recreates welfare and recreates welfare dependence, then you have a very corrupt outcome that, in my view, is almost like restoring serfdom. And serfdom in the Middle Ages was where you were reliant upon somebody else for your sustenance, for your maintenance and welfare. In our societies, is beginning to function in certain European and American economies like that.
Is the same thing happening in Europe?
Yes, undoubtedly. The trends are present everywhere, but obviously what people do makes a difference. So they're more or less pronounced depending upon the policies pursued. But generally speaking, neoliberal policies enrich the few and then create massive welfare demands and dependence by the many.
But in Europe, we're combining that with massive unemployment, aren't we? Is there any way out of all that?
Well, there's always ways out, because in the end, these things are human creations, so nothing is there of necessity. But what happens is, look, if you look at human civilization, it's just not true that everything always prospers. Civilizations really do die, civilizations really do pass away, cultures and economies really do stagnate, and stagnate for a long period of time. And this happens primarily because those that are powerful get into almost an unbreachable position. They become so dominant, it's very difficult to challenge them in any way, shape or form. And I think the danger is in our economies is we're approaching something like this. And when you're in those situations, it's really difficult, unless you have a very radical anti-monopoly, anti-cartel, new ethical trading paradigm that you domesticate rather than internationalize. Unless you recreate those sort of paradigms, you're going to be in real trouble.
What about the difference between the wealth creation in the East? It's China and India and the Latin American countries.
Well, there's no
and the West.
Well, in one sense, it's very different, in the sense that people are being lifted out of poverty, and they're creating sort of, if you want, Western style outcomes. But those Western style outcomes are not entirely foreign to what we have in the West now. So income inequality and differentials of outcomes are really problematic in the East as well. And in many ways, you're recreating a Marxist type situation that happened in the 19th century, where you had people who were just in effect wage earners and could only increase the standard of living by coming together to strike, for example, with those who did own capital. So what you're doing in a way is the East is speeding up, but I still think it's in a 19th century paradigm. Certainly not in a 20th century paradigm. It's certainly not in a 21st century win-win capitalism, which is what I would argue for.
And to change this, are we likely to see revolutions in the States or in Europe?
Well, you can have soft revolutions or hard revolutions. I think you'll see soft revolutions almost everywhere because this becomes something that people won't tolerate. Hard revolutions, I think, will only happen in Europe if the euro is maintained in its current strictures under a German aegis, because then it becomes impossible to see how the southern European economies can ever break out of it.
So if austerity, as per Merkel, is continued in Europe, you think there'll be hard revolutions?
Well, I think, look, it's not really sort of austerity versus stimulation. That isn't the issue. The issue is that these countries cannot internally devalue to a level of wage competitiveness that will give them a future if they remain in the euro. Yes. And it's remaining in the euro that essentially will break these countries. And I think politicians from the populist left or right will be elected who will not only break with the euro, but might even break with the EU.
Of course, the Germans are spending all their money trying to keep it together.
Well, they're not spending all their money, but they are trying to keep it together. That's the point, and that's the problem. And what Germany doesn't realise is it could ruin Europe for the third time. Unless it does what's necessary, you will see a situation where a half-botched German attempt to save the euro at any cost becomes sacrificing the European Union at a far greater cost.
But for the third time, Germany could wreck Europe. That's your saying?
Yes, that's perfectly possible.
Now, in the US...
I'm quoting Joschka Fischer here. I'm not even innovating in this analysis.
In the US, you think it'll have, if there is to be a change, it'll be by some sort of soft revolution?
Yes, I think what will happen in the US is people will want a proper capitalism. A capitalism where you just don't have people kind of winning at the top, where there is an equal and level competitive playing field. So I see a small business, self-employed type revolution, whereby using new technology, new sources of capital, finance, and a proper understanding of competition law, that actually the concentrations of economic power in the US will be challenged.
I can't see that in either of the presidential candidates.
No, but we're still in the interregnum. We're still not, we don't yet have a Western politician who's truly 21st century.
And finally, all this is not good for stock markets longer term.
Well, stock markets haven't been good for a very long period. And they haven't been very good for a very long period because, in effect, the real rewards have been creamed off by the managers rather than the owners of the stock.
And the rich families get richer.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much.
Real pleasure. Thank you.